Welcome to Tools for Liberty, a Facebook vlog about different topics. We're so glad that you have joined us. We are here today from Trinity Church of the Nazarene. This is a series in connection with Dalton Church of the Nazarene. This is Pastor Dylan Proctor, and I am Pastor Amanda Sparrow.
Well, today we're going to be discussing a couple of things. We're going to be looking at the main idea of grief, but we're also going to be examining a couple of things. Just to give a quick overview of today's program, we're going to be talking about righteousness, grief, and male rompers. So that's the sort of tip you get. You can hang on towards the end of this if you want to hear everything we're going to talk about. But let's go ahead and get started with the word of the day, righteousness. So this is a word that you may or may not have heard. It's oftentimes associated with the church. It's an ancient word. If you go back to the ancient languages of the world, it's the same word for justice, the same word for equity, not equality, but equity. And it's sort of this word that means there's different variables out there in the cosmos. And when righteousness is a thing, when justice is a thing, all the different variables are in proper order with one another. A lot of times as the church has developed doctrines around this and they create good definitions around this, it's the idea of right relationships between different things, whether it be people, whether it be businesses, whether it be, inanimate institutions or animate groups of people or things of that nature. The things in the world have to be in proper perspective with one another. So we're going to be examining righteousness today a little bit with the topic of grief. So, Amanda, I'll let you go right into our topic.
All right, so as he mentioned, that our main topic today is grief, and we have decided that this is a topic that needs to be talked about because as we have looked around in our world and in our kind of immediate circles, there has been a lot happening in our communities. And we want to talk about grief not just only in the loss of a person through death, but any kind of loss that may happen in people's lives. Suffering is a reality of our lives and of our world, and our response to this is grief. And so as we talk through this today, we are talking about people who have lost loved ones, relationships that have been broken, and so there's been a loss of maybe communication or intimacy, and losses of jobs, or any number of things that would cause suffering and therefore grief in our lives. And so how we respond, like I said, is grief. And often we kind of are left with two options. We can either move through grief healthfully, and I do want to say move through and not get over, because we do not want to trivialize the painful process that is grief. But we do have to move through it, or we can wallow in it and kind of stay in the sense of grief, or just being a victim in it.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about wallowing in it, because this is one of the things that really happens in our world, especially within the church. People a lot of times will misuse Christian doctrine. They'll misinterpret Christ to sort of justify wallowing in grief and wallowing in the miserable things that happen in life. And let me just explain this just a little bit what I mean. A lot of times people will look to the New Testament and they'll hear things like the last will be first. They'll look at Christ going out to deal with people who are afflictions, and they start to attribute some sort of virtue with victimhood. And they forget that the virtue that is associated there is how we get through whatever it is that may victimize a person or cause somebody to have grief. The virtue is how we overcome things. It's not just in being in some sort of decayed state. And one example I want to talk about in the New Testament is when there's the man who is lowered through the roof, the paralytic. It's a very interesting story. We see it a couple of times in the various Gospels. We see this man who is lowered through the roof. He has something wrong with his foot, and Jesus comes over and he heals this man. There's so much to this story. But what we see happening in all of the stories where Christ deals with people is there's somebody that has something in their life which seems immovable. And Christ, whenever he comes to deal with them, he takes that away, and there is a healthy movement out of that. The man who just has his paralyzed condition fixed, he doesn't stay and wallow in it. Jesus doesn't say, go and take your bed and go sit on your bed on the side of the road. No, he says, get up and go and interact with society in a meaningful way, because this is really what has happened. People were unable to interact with society in a meaningful way, but after Jesus deals with them, they're then able to. And really one of the ways that I see this being misused in Christian doctrine is people say, well, we're called to be humble. And they'll say we're called to be the last. And they'll take this and they'll attribute virtue to being sort of this state of what I would really call weakness. And the problem with that is it forsakes the whole side of Christ, which was transformation towards something which is better. And people will no longer have a goal of this sort of proper order of things, but people will simply say, it's my pious duty to be inadequate in the world around us. We see this whether it be people's theology of sin, whether it's their theology of so many things in the world, they'll sort of attribute this virtue to coming out and saying, I have all these things wrong with me. And instead of being motivated towards something better, they have this sort of pious inadequacy where they say it's the best thing for me to do to go out and confess everything that's wrong with me and never have any plan or any really intention on moving towards something which is better.
And so that kind of leads us into then what the second response, if we're not going to wallow, is the healthy progression through grief. And so I think we have to have a goal in mind and know where we're going as we have encountered whatever the suffering may be. How do we go through it? And so I think the goal is righteousness. And as Dylan had defined it earlier on, it is where things have been set right, or everything has become in its appropriate order. And I think we have to, though, recognize that when we say appropriate order, it doesn't mean a reset. So when we are seeking reconciliation or for things to become righteous, whether it is a relationship or a situation, things may not be exactly like they were. Especially, specifically, let's talk about relationships. If something has occurred where two people are in a relationship and it has become broken, even if that relationship is fixed and mended, it may not act, and those two people may not relate to one another exactly the same way that they did beforehand. And that could be a good thing, because maybe beforehand it wasn't really righteous to begin with. And so we're not just simply talking about turning back the clock or reversing harmful things that have happened or forgetting, but we are talking about righteousness and things being set up as they really should be. The other thing is, we can't force people to reconcile. Often when we go through grief, if it's like in the loss of a person or someone we love, obviously we can't bring them back from the dead and have that kind of same relationship we did beforehand. If it's between two people or two groups of people or whatever the dynamic, 3 or 4 people, is we can't force the other person to reconcile. We can seek forgiveness, we can repent, we can forgive the other person if they were the one who harmed us, but we can't force them to come back into righteousness. And so I think we have to recognize all of these things as we are moving through grief, and to also realize it is a process. You're not going to wake up one day and be like, I feel better, everything's okay. But there is a movement and an intentionality to not stay where we are, to not wallow or maintain this posture of weakness, but say, I do want to get better, I do want to be healthy, I do want to live in right relatedness, in righteousness, with myself, with other people, with creation, with God. And so there has to be a movement. It's not easy, but we do have to have that intention and those actions to go towards it.
Yeah, and I think Amanda has brought one of the best points that I've heard anyone say in a long time, is that when that righteousness and even when justice happens, the relationship may be different. And I think she's so spot on for saying that. I know just hearing that it's really stimulating. Think about that, because so many times we do want to just turn back the clock and have it the way it was before. But sometimes the way righteousness happens is just like she said, it's a new shape, it's a new order of things, but it is now the best order of things. Well, one thing I'd like to add to that is when we as the church, we go and we love people, when we see Christ go out and love people, especially, for instance, the man who was brought down through the roof, his friends come and bring him down through the roof, and it's the faith of the friends which Jesus sees and responds to. Well, when this man is brought in, they see all of this, and Jesus loves the person, but he creates an opportunity for that person to receive and be transformed. When we love people, and sort of to build off of what she said, we cannot, as one side, force other people to behave a certain way. A lot of times people have this idea that, if we go over and we have, insert society-created virtue here, like we say we're going to go be tolerant or something, you cannot force the other side to do that. You can't force the other side to reconcile. You can't force another side to be peaceful. But what you can do is when we love people, we are creating opportunity for them to behave a certain way. And we have a responsibility, especially anybody who's a human being who doesn't want to be, antisocial, and I mean that in sort of the actual meaning of the term, not somebody who's just shy. But if you're going to do anything which is meaningful and constructive, we have to create opportunities for something better. And building again off what she said, there has to be a goal in mind. We have to say, well, I don't want to just wallow here. A lot of people in our society, they put that virtue there on this sort of decayed state, and they haven't put the goal on what is the most constructive state that I can be in. And we've got to, as we love people, as we're the church, as we're constructive human beings, we say we want to love people, we have to open the door and say we want to open the door for a new goal, where the man is lowered down through the roof and he doesn't go home and sit on his bed, but he goes home and then he gets up the next day and he goes out and he interacts with society on a greater scale.
And I think in going off of your example of the paralytic man who's lowered through the roof, is some of those opportunities was created by the people around him. So he could not, in his current condition, he couldn't get to Jesus. And so his friends come around him and they say, okay, we see you're in a bad situation. We know this is not the healthy situation. We're going to help create this opportunity for you to encounter Jesus. And so I think as we talk about grief, we don't need to just talk about the individual moving through grief, but the community around the individual. And the responsibility of the community to participate in the process through grief, and how we can create these opportunities for love and for healing and for hope. And it's not always either easy, and it can be awkward. And sometimes the greatest ways we can create an opportunity or to support someone going through grief is not to have all the right answers or to say the right things or even to do whatever we think. It's not busy work or moving around, but sometimes it's simply being present. And presence and saying to someone, I recognize you're here and you want to be here and you want to move to a healthy place. I want to support you. And I think especially in the church, this is what we are called to do.
Yeah, and one of the questions I see people ask is, well, where is God in this? And, insert terrible thing happening in the world here, they'll look at this and say, well, where is God in these things? If we have a good, and one of the things that I talk about all the time is I want our theology, and I'm talking really specifically about the church, I want our theology to be complete. I want it to be holistically complete and comprehensive from beginning to end. I want us to have, if somebody can find one part of our theological DNA, they should be able to examine the rest of it, because it all should be complete and unified. Well, the thing is, a lot of times we describe the church as the body of Christ. People look to the New Testament, they see, well, after Christ ascended, then the body of Christ now is the church, and we understand that we're the bride of Christ. If we actually believe this, people ask, where is God physically in this? Well, the answer to that is in the church. And that means that for the church, we have a huge responsibility to go out and deal with the situations in the world. I firmly believe that the church must receive information about everything in the world and have the discernment to use it properly. We have to address all the things in the world. Where is God materially? And by material, I mean flesh and blood and the suffering in the world. It's where the church goes and gathers around people. As a minister, one of the things I've seen, which is so fascinating, people in all sorts of places in life, when actually they're willing members of the church, willing members of that body to come and gather around them, such wonderful things can happen. And the restoration that happens isn't always a turning back of the clock. Sometimes it's just holding on with people through these final moments. But when we see people gather around, that is something which is so important for people to really do that, to gather around.
Yes, and so that's kind of been our conversation on grief, and hopefully it's been encouraging and something that you can implement and think about in your own lives, in your own communities, in your own church congregations, whether it be at Trinity or Jolton or anywhere else that you may worship. But now we're going to kind of turn a little bit to something a little bit more ridiculous. However, it seems to be a growing trend in our society, and I think also reflects some maybe serious thought patterns. But anyways, let's Dylan, what are some current issues in our culture that you would like to talk about that deal with righteousness?
A current issue in our culture dealing with righteousness, and maybe even with grief as well, is male rompers. So I didn't actually even know what male rompers were until somebody brought it up. They actually brought it up at the Jolton church one day. Can you explain to everyone who may not know what are rompers and specifically male rompers there?
So rompers originally, well, I don't know originally, I guess you'd have to do a history on it, but normally it's a female garment. They're shorts and kind of a tank top or a short sleeve shirt, but they're connected. So it's kind of like a onesie, but for adults. And recently there has been a trend to then translate this into male fashion. Yes. And they usually tend to be pastel or floral kind of in appearance.
Yeah, and I would say this is what I would call a onesie. If somebody showed this to me, my first statement would be that's a onesie. Yeah, so this was brought up, and the reason why I think this really is a current issue in our culture is because we have seen something in our world where people are moving away from talent, from fine disciplines to just whatever can get the wow and shock factor, or whatever is the most, I would say, loud and sort of beyond just volume loud, but whatever is the most shocking and visually stimulating thing that somebody may do that just like gets shocked. People have come to attribute virtue to that. And back to the idea of righteousness, the appropriate order in things. We have moved virtue from places that are constructive to saying what is now meaningful is whatever can get this, reaction from people. And I think the male rompers is a good examination of that, because again, it's something where it's weird, it's out there. I can't logically think of any reason why I would ever have one, or I didn't even know what they were until somebody brought it up. But tell me what you see the romper being a side effect of, Amanda.
Well, I think you're right. It really is just kind of, I think there's some things in our society that may have, that aren't working, and so we're trying to challenge them, but we don't always challenge things in appropriate manners. So we're not actually challenging things to move towards righteousness or to equity, but we're just kind of like, let's just do something insane, and kind of like we're being rebels for the sake of being a rebel, and not moving towards anything constructive.
Yeah, and I realize a lot of times when chaos is created, there's an opportunity for order, whether you were the one who created chaos or not. But I see a lot of people who just have the taste for chaos.
Yes.
And one of the things I love to talk about is the Logos. I think if there's anything that the church has forsaken in terms of the intellectual side of the church, it's we have forgotten the Logos. It's time to mess up some people's poor theologies of love and bring the Logos back into things, because it is this movement from chaos to order. But in our world, we see a lot of order to chaos, and I think the romper is really a very pastel, grotesque movement towards chaos. And I've seen a lot of pastel movements towards chaos. We had within the Church of the Nazarene, we had these assemblies and things, and they had this group that come up that was singing like Southern Gospel very clearly to like reach to a certain group of people. Almost like, it's just this thing going on, and we see just our world is not always moving towards order. There are times when things are moving towards chaos, and I think the romper is a movement towards chaos.
Well, and it is quite ridiculous. I think Dr. Hoskins would put this under the theological category of silly, but I think they do reveal something very serious about our culture, and something that is either righteousness or destructive. Again, we hope you have enjoyed this session and our conversations. And if you have any more questions or topics that you would like us to discuss in the future, please leave comments. Please keep them polite. And we hope that you enjoy your day.
Yes, and do have good social skills when posting comments. It's always good to have good social skills in life. One other thing that Amanda doesn't actually know, I'm hoping we can actually have a guest come online with us next week to talk about grief. Again, so it'll be an extension of what we talked about today. I know someone who can talk about this much more beautifully than I can. He can articulate things fantastic, so I'm trying to work that out. So that will be happening. It may happen as sort of a sidestep from the normal Tools for Liberty if scheduling just works that way, but we are hoping to have a guest on for that. But aside from that, we're good?
We're good.
All right, well, have a good day.